So I saw the film first at Cannes. It was sort of one of my first outings in the world of film festivals again. It felt so ecstatic to see it there on that big, fabulous screen.
Yeah.
What was it like for you guys to be back on the circuit? I saw you at New York as well. Julie?
Surreal. It was surreal. It was. I didn't believe it was happening until we were there, and then, we've never had that experience, that kind of experience, as documentary makers. It was really surreal and special, and we kind of feel jaded about. We're used to everything with festivals, and that was very new and very wonderful, actually.
But it is nice to actually be back. There's something about closing the loop with an audience when you're making a film. It really feels like it's landed and it's off on its life when you get to see it in front of people. So I'm really glad that we get to do it again.
And this movie, Todd, you've explored glam rock, you've explored Bob Dylan, you've gone with Karen Carpenter and Barbie dolls, but you haven't been a documentary filmmaker before. It's like, what gave you that confidence to jump into this? Why did you have to do it this way?
Well, it came to me as a offer, as a question from David Blackman at Universal Music Group Hologram, who I think had been talking to Laurie Anderson after she had handed off the Lou Reed archives to the New York City Public Library, and they started to talk about, would this be a time to do a Velvet's documentary, and if so, who might be some directors that she felt comfortable approaching. And so he just said, would Todd be interested in doing a Velvet Underground documentary? I was immediately, within a second, yes, absolutely. And I knew, and it's not necessarily that I had been burning to necessarily make a documentary. I felt like this is an art form, a form of filmmaking that I love, but that I don't, necessarily presume to know how to do. What it was about this band, the music that meant so much to me. And the band doesn't exist in traditional places that other rock documentary subjects might be, in promotional footage, in concert footage, and all those things. Where the Velvet Underground existed was in the art scene, in the filmmaking of Andy Warhol, and so bound up in that avant-garde film and art and cultural moment. So I was like, that is so interesting. The limitations were the creative opportunities, And I knew that it meant the film would look and feel completely unique and worthy of the subject in that way.
So you obviously pulled some people around you who did know
Yes.
what they were doing.
Yes, very quickly.
So Julie, I mean, you're one of the most experienced. You've been around. How did you respond to this?
Oh, well, when David Blackman also called us, it was, I'd say, half a second before we were like, yes. I mean, the three of us are all big fans of Velvet Underground and all love Todd's filmmaking and his work as an artist. And the idea of collaborating on this film with Todd and Christine, we were like,
He told us the concept in 5 minutes, and we were like, we can see that. Yeah. And I think you delivered it, Todd.
And when we were discussing the project, I literally screamed because I'm such a huge Velvet's fan. I'm a huge Andy Warhol fan. I'm a huge fan of Todd. So just like all of that coming together, I screamed.
Like somebody just came in and said, "Here's your dream." It was really.
Carolyn, you were a great
It was
asset
David
for research
who talked
for
to you
that.
guys first. Even though in my view of it, it was Christine who said we need partners.
Vashon, your
Vashon,
partner,
my
but that's
producer.
missing tonight.
But then
she
she communicated to David, and we had
because-
done the Apollo with David, so he
right,
knew us.
Right, because Christine was like, these are the people we have to work with. And Christine had researched them and just took a second and was like, these are our people. And it was just so immediately apparent that was true.
So
We
tell
had
me
lunch
how.
and we knew.
Go ahead. But I'm curious about what were in my mind, your ability to reinvent the documentary, to come at it with fresh eyes, to not know what the rules were, was an asset. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
I
it's a
mean,
new language. That was the idea. The idea, can we tell it through these images? Can we tell it through this so we could experience it rather than understand it just intellectually? It became visceral.
And you were the archive maven, as I understand it. That must have been part of what you were excited by.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
She gave you your presence.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, to tell the story, you need the cooperation of the Warhol Museum because all of their incredible, it's really the majority of what has been filmed of the Velvet Underground is what was filmed at the factory. So that was a first relationship that we quickly started to set up. And it was just like the most fun trip. We all, with Christine and us and Brian O'Keefe, our archival producer, got to go to Pittsburgh at the museum.
which was closed. We got
which
to
was-
wander around
yeah.
the closed museum.
And they were bringing out all of these artifacts, with white gloves to show us everything. And I'm just nerding out because I'm just loving everything that they're showing us.
Is there an original album cover with the banana?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like the stuff they were showing us was insane, and Greg Pierce, who's the curator, the archivist at the museum. He was just a huge resource because it wasn't. He has this encyclopedic knowledge of what Warhol did, but he also knows all the other artists that were in that scene. So he would tell us, you need to think about this artist. There's a film called Super Artist that we licensed that was by Juan, and Bruce Talbert, yes. And he said, I think
MoMA had just had the
they
restored
had
version.
they had the original version
version.
that was shown in 1968 that no one had really seen.
It's the part where the kid's voice is saying, "There's a band called the Velvet Underground," with all these crazy clips.
images. So sorry, I'm just like spinning out, but it was just so much fun to really kind of dig in and explore not just the band itself, which is just so great, and they're all just so wonderful storytellers in and of themselves. Like Mo's delivery is hysterical. Lou's sense of humor is outrageous. Just like listening to his interviews was so much fun. But then to delve into the avant-garde and experimental cinema as well was extraordinary. And like Brian O'Keefe did an amazing job kind of curating the films that we should really look at. And so that was
Very long list.
a very long list.
But Todd, you knew a lot of this stuff already. I mean, you're the old brown semiotician,
I did, but it was. Brian is my partner. He's an insane researcher, and he just did the deep dive into it. And it's a broad dive. It's a deep and broad dive. And but it was like, but as Carolyn says, the sort of prerequisite for making the film, there was no way we'd have been able to make the film without an agreement with the Andy Warhol, with the Warhol Films and their archive. And it also established the terms and the issues of how we would pay for it, because we wanted to establish the sort of initial agreement with what they would allow us to do per minute, and use that when we approached other archives. So it was a building block, but if they had said no, that would be it. And they knew that we needed them, and that gave them some leverage, but they also knew that they needed this. They needed this film. This is not the Andy Warhol Foundation that deals with the paintings. This is the Andy Warhol Museum that deals with the films. And they're very different entities, obviously.
So how hard was it to get John Cale on board? He is the most extraordinary revelation for me in this.
Again, there would be no way to make it without John's agreement and blessing, and an agreement to participate and give of himself. How much you ever are going to get, I'm learning as a fresh documentarian, is something you don't know. And the process in which you try to make them comfortable and come prepared and make them feel like you've really done your work on your end, but that you let them go where they're going to go. And John's, an extraordinary artist who there are times in any artist's life where they feel like talking about the past, and there are times where they maybe don't feel like talking about the past. So you want to gauge it appropriately. So we had to a lot of it was a dance of coaxing and courting.
And dealing with gatekeepers.
And gatekeepers. This is sort of a dysfunction. No, John excluded. There's sort of a dysfunctional family around the factory folks.
But also a lot of them were off the grid, too.
Yeah.
Like Jonathan Richman, it was like,
They don't
Duties
have
and
email addresses.
he doesn't have an
They
email
don't
address. He
have
doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have a computer.
answering machine.
So he doesn't fly.
So how did you find him?
Don Fleming, who is he works with Laurie Anderson and the Lou Reed estate, knew a DJ who interviewed him one time, who knew a friend who knew the manager. So I called all those people, and then finally got to Jonathan, and he was like, "Of course I'll do this for you."
Oh, that was money. That was money.
Yeah.
He was great. I mean,
Mo.
It was the same
Mo Tucker.
kind of really difficult.
Kind of.
you had your friends from Yola Tango
I did.
Yeah.
reach out to
Reach
Mo.
out.
I didn't fail. I wrote a letter to
He wrote a beautiful
Georgia.
letter.
Never got to her.
Yeah, and it was Sal McCurry, who he's a personal he has his own personal archive. He works a lot with Doug Yule. He's a super fan who became friends with all the band members, and he tried a couple times and he just couldn't get through to her. And then one day I was talking to him and he said, "You know what? I'll call you back." And he hung up, and I didn't know this. He called her and got her. She actually picked up the phone. And he said, "I'm having a producer call you." And he hung up, and he said, "If you call right now, she will pick up." And I, it's like Maureen Tucker. So, I was all nervous, but she was like, "Of course, yeah. If you just have to come to Georgia, and I'll do an interview with you guys."
Wow.
Remote Georgia.
And then you had Ed Lockman doing 16 millimeter. Explain that.
He did. It was digital. He shot it on digital, but he did Super 8. We did Super 8 pieces on everybody, which we used a lot in the film. We grained up our
You
digital.
wanted everything to sort of get in the same world.
We did, and a lot of it is also the way. Really, it's about how all of the interview sections are framed. They're formatted in a 1:3:3 aspect ratio. The sort of geometric formal language is about how does the 1:3:3 aspect ratio, which is, as many of you guys know, is the 16 millimeter square. How does that is really our vernacular. So if you do two squares and they touch the left and the right margins of the frame in a diptych, as Warhol would do with Chelsea Girls, that became one format. But if you turn it into four squares, like we do for the Pale Blue Eyes, what's his name? Brackage, thank you. Stan Brackage section, it's a 4-square grid, and then we explode into 12 frames for the 60s section, and everything in between. Sometimes you zoom completely push right into the 60 millimeter frame, lose some of the left and right top and bottom when it's full frame aspect ratio, 1:8:5. This sounds technical and boring, but for me it was a palette to dive into.
As
that
were
I
the
could
backdrops.
bring the backdrops,
And
which I
I
could
loved-
bring my editors into.
All right, talk about the backdrops, but I also loved the sections where you had the Warhol shots of these guys staring at the
screen
camera.
tests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That had the weirdest impact. Did you understand how it was going to play? Tell me what what you were going for there.
Well, look, these are very famous images, and most of us have seen stills from the screen tests and maybe clips in documentaries about Warhol. I've never watched an entire screen test from beginning to end, a 2.5-minute reel from sprockets to sprockets, emulsion coming in and emulsion going out. And it wasn't until we started to construct this first act of the film, and you literally watch Lou Reed breathing and existing in time next to a composite shot and a parallel shot that's describing his childhood. And you feel like he's both witnessing the act of storytelling itself, which sort of pulls you out, and then you actually feel like you're living with him in time, and which pulls you in at the same time. So we had these ideas in our head, but it's not until you really watch them unfold that I think the power of the surprise of that recognition comes through, even for us while making it.
So when you were working with your editors, this was during the pandemic?
Adam had, you guys described, because it was a scheduling and budgeting thing that Christine and I would never have been able to figure out.
It's called overages.
It's called documentary,
Well, I mean, really what happened is we shot all of the interviews.
In 2018.
Yeah, and then Todd went to make Dark Waters, his fiction feature film, with Fonz. And Adam, so the editors are Fonzo and Adam was in our office in Brooklyn editing and in communication with Todd and Fonz during that period. And then after your film released, you came back and you and Fonz were in LA, and then COVID hit. And then they were a bubble here, and Adam, we kind of like rushed him home with his system in Brooklyn, and he started editing from there. So that was the communication.
But I guess I'm asking this because given how complex and visually sophisticated this was, it must have been even harder to gauge somehow how it was working in this digital universe. Maybe not.
It was full immersion by necessity, and even deeper immersion after COVID. And so Fonzie and I were already in the same room, so we quarantined together. Okay. So we were just living with each other, and I would go every day. I could walk to work in Venice, where I was staying, go into this world in that very uncertain, crazy time. And I was cutting on an Avid. Fonzie was cutting on an Avid. Adam was in New York cutting on an Avid, and we would just be swapping everything we're doing all day long, and we didn't want it to end. It was such an incredibly nourishing creative experience for us.
I can see that.
And Todd did a lot of editing himself. You know, Adam and Fonz are brilliant editors, but it was really three of them with Avids, cutting all these scenes.
Well, you had time to noodle around and experiment. I think it shows, actually. It almost, all right, so someone said you actually had 2.5 hours of footage in a 2-hour movie, which is a way to go.
With
It was
interviews.
fun clearing it all.
I was going to ask that question. How bad was it?
So we're almost done.
There are orphan things in the world, and you go do your due diligence and you try to find who it belongs to, but at some point it becomes something that you just use, and I think at the 11th hour somebody popped up on not long ago, and we had a discussion and we compensated them and it was fine, but you never know when it's going to happen. When I think we're clear now, right? I think we're almost
In our
there.
clearance letter, we call Chicken Little because it's like as soon as we called him, he was like, "This is gonna cost $1 million." Like he's always like, "It's gonna be a disaster." And it was totally a lovely person. It was fine. They came to the screening last night. It was all good. But it's always that kind of feeling of like somebody imposing that panic.
And it really was UMG. It was David Blackman and UMG who ultimately covered the overages at a point where we really didn't know how we were going to make the difference.
Well, you know what? They saw this film and they believed in it and they loved it. Like that was the thing. I mean, Adam always said when he was nervous when David first came to look at the first cut or the first assembly, and David was like,
He didn't
"This
flinch.
is great."
Oh, David was with us. David saw it too. That's why David was excited because of you, because of your vision, and I think that it paid off. He could see it evolving forward, that it was getting there.
And Apple TV Plus came in also.
Yes. So that was sold to them in Cannes 2 years ago.
And you're a man who likes to see your movie on the big screen.
Yes.
It's going to be day and date?
It
Tomorrow.
is
It opens.
tomorrow, but they supported and stood by, even amid COVID, the conditions that we wanted this to be a theatrical release. and it's opening in 100 theaters around the country, and about
140.
140.
140.
I think.
That's incredible.
Magnolia Pictures, the wonderful
Magnolia
distributor,
Pictures had
came
partnered
on
with
board.
us, and so, as you guys know, as filmmakers, and it's different for different films, but we all want to see our films on the screen. It wasn't, when I saw it at Cannes, it was, of course, seeing it on that gorgeous screen at the Lumiere Theater, but it was the sound. It was the impact of the sound, and that's something no home theater is going to be able to replicate. So if you liked what you saw, and we're urging people to try
Spread
to
the
go to the
word.
theater and
Yeah.
see it while it's still on the screen.
So I understand John Cale saw it last night for the first time
First time,
First
on,
time on the
screen.
screen.
on the big screen. All right. What did he say?
He loved it.
Okay.
His
Well, he comes off well.
his partner in crime sent it in like a love letter. It was just great. It was really special, and he was just so
He
generous
was
and
on
wonderful.
stage with me afterwards. I'm still a fan at heart, so I'm just like, I'm sitting there next to John Cale, and John Cale's in my movie, and he gave so much of himself, and he's such an eloquent, he also looks so incredibly gorgeous. He looks insanely
Total crush.
beautiful. It's just, thank you, Ed Lockman, and your lighting, but also those Welsh bones and genes and whatever he inherited, it's doing him well.
Well, the thing I wanted you to answer a little bit is it isn't so much just the music as it is the cultural petri dish that the music was in, and I wondered if you could explain how you see the Velvet Underground having impacted the future.
Well, I think what they were doing, and I think you see it, maybe they themselves didn't see this as clearly until they went to the West Coast, and it was a clash of countercultures. And they really saw that what was happening in the New York world was so informed by this sort of ulterior, queer, sort of investment in a kind of marginality that revealed things about the counterculture at large that were a little bit bourgeois by comparison, to say, is one way of putting it, a little uptight, a little sexist, a little homophobic, That's why the feminist movement needed to happen at the end of the 60s. That's why a gay liberation movement needed to happen in the 1970s. But what was so unique about what was happening in New York is that it wasn't political, it wasn't intellectual, it was aesthetic. But it provided a way of seeing the world that I think hadn't been explored, even amid so much incredible stuff that was happening in the 60s. And it opened the door for glam rock and punk rock and grunge and so many other kinds of expressions of, not always affirmative experiences.
And independent cinema.
And independent.
And you. Right?
Yeah, no, and the new queer cinema, there's something about that sense of a standing in opposition to the status quo and maintaining a critical perspective on dominant culture, for lack of a better word. That was certainly something that I felt like I was, inspired by the Velvets.
We could go on, but I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to wrap it up on a sad note. Today, one of the great documentary producer, filmmakers, executives, Diane Weierman from Participant, passed away. And I know, Julie, you were close to her. All of you knew her, and I knew her, and I'm very sad. And I just want to celebrate her a bit and remember her.
Watch a Diane movie this week.
I mean, her impact on the documentary field is like unprecedented. She's completely shaped kind of where we are today. So it was
From Inconvenient Truth
Yeah.
to any number of things.
And as Al
American
Gore
Factory.
said to
Yeah.
her sister, that she changed the world with
Yeah.
her movies. And I think that allowed her sister to see her for the first time in full, to really appreciate what she'd lost.
Yeah, it's a huge loss for
Yeah.
It was her whole life. She gave herself to the films and never stopped. All right. Thank you all. Welcome back.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, everyone.